In a world full of bold health claims and conflicting advice, skepticism feels like armor. But what happens when that armor starts to limit our growth? Welcome to the Aging Well podcast, where we explore the science, stories, and strategies that help us live longer, healthier, and more purposeful lives. I am your host, Dr. Jeff Armstrong, an exercise physiologist with a passion for making science simple and life better as we age, with my co-host, Corbin Bruton. In a recent episode, Decoding RCP, I made the comment that skepticism is healthy, but curiosity is essential. Today, we unpack what that really means. We'll explore why skepticism protects us, why curiosity transforms us, and how holding both together may be one of the most important skills for aging well in a rapidly changing world.
Dr. Armstrong, let's start with the line itself. Now, when you say skepticism is healthy, but curiosity is essential, what are you getting at?
So that line's coming from our, I believe it's the second episode on the RCP protocol, or decoding the RCP protocol. And I don't know, it kind of came to me, but it's, when we talk about, skepticism, especially in our society today, is, we tend to, I don't know, in some ways kind of poo-poo the idea of skepticism, or, the feeling that we shouldn't be skeptic, or we, have to be skeptic. I don't know. It's just, skepticism allows us to really question everything. I mean, as a professor, I tell my students this all the time. You need to, you don't just accept everything that I tell you. You need to question. And so the idea, skepticism being healthy is going to get us to the right answers. And more important, we need to be curious. We have to have an interest in things and not just accept things as they are, as status quo. We need to be questioning everything, and we have to be approaching everything with questions. I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm sure we're going to kind of dive into this a little bit deeper and explore the idea of skepticism being healthy and curiosity being essential. What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are, I agree with you. I definitely think we need to question things. There's a lot, and especially in the age of the internet, where there's so much information that's just getting mass produced out there. And sometimes some of that information can be really informative, and sometimes it's absolutely incorrect. And it's okay to question things and do the research yourself and dive into it, and not to get too down the rabbit hole. But when it comes to our health, especially if we're being told, hey, this is the only way that you need to go about it in order to be healthier, do the research yourself. Look into it and say, should I really be taking that pill? Should I really be taking that drug? Do I really need to inject this thing into my body? Or do I need to do more research on it before I make that decision on what's right for me? So yeah, I agree with you on that. But a lot of people may or may not agree. So why do you think skepticism has become such a dominant posture, especially in conversations about health, aging, and longevity?
Well, you mentioned the internet, and I think that's where my skepticism has just gone through the roof, because we're in an age of grifters, the people that are just on the internet and they're selling some agenda, and people that I used to respect, and I'm not going to name any names, but there are very few of them, particularly in like the longevity circles and, many of the physicians that are on the internet, that I have a great deal of respect for, because they are always pushing something. There's always going to be a supplement at the end of their video, or something that they are peddling that will cure the issue at hand. And there's very few that I respect, and I think we've had several on this podcast that I really, really enjoy, and I think that this idea that, everybody has an agenda should cause us to be a bit more skeptical. And it's become dominant because you feel like you can't trust anybody because there's so much, one side says this when the other side says that. A lot of, the information that we're receiving has become greatly politicized, or, everybody is trying to stand out from everybody else. And so they're going to be controversial. And so when we look at health, aging, and longevity, you got to question what's the person's agenda and what are they selling? And, can we trust what we're getting from them? And so you have to go into it all with an element of distrust.
Yeah, and that can be kind of walking a thin line. Like for us, for example, we have affiliates, and we would recommend some of their product, but we've also tested their products out. We've also done the research on them, and if we encourage our listeners to do their own research, but there are also recommendations that we're doing. We're full disclosure though, we're not necessarily doing it to push and say, oh, you have to take this particular supplement. This is the best thing. You'll get instant results, because we're not trying to do that. I think Dr. Armstrong preaches, try and get your nutrition in from whole foods. Supplement is just supplementation of the foods that you're not able to get hold of, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, when you look at the affiliates that we do promote, at the root of everything, they're telling you eat right, get exercise, get your sleep in line. And the supplements that we provide are just that, they're supplements. And so you shouldn't be going first to, the putting a Band-Aid on the problem. You want to go, what is the root cause of the problem? Get deep into what's going on and what do I need to fix first? And in the process of fixing that, what do I maybe add into my diet or into my lifestyle in order to bring everything a bit more in alignment? And so, I think it's important for us to have that skepticism. It's like, do I absolutely need this, or is there something else that I can be doing that's going to be cheaper? And lifestyle changes don't cost much, but supplements will cost you through the roof.
That is also true. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's probably a lot of things in today's society that causes people to not trust the information that's given to them. So I guess my question is, what does healthy skepticism actually look like? And how does it differ from like being cynical or dismissive towards the information that you're getting?
Well, I think there's a definite distinction between skepticism and dismissal. I mean, dismissal, just you're not even going to address it. You're either in denial that what you believe can be wrong, or you just don't care, and you're just going to, screw it, I don't need to know this. Cynicism, I think, is just more of that negative approach to skepticism. Skepticism is is when there's curiosity tied to it. Cynicism is that desire to prove everybody wrong, and so skepticism, we're looking for the right answer. Cynicism, we're looking to prove others wrong, I think, is the big thing. And so it's really more of a matter of attitude than, healthy curiosity. And so I think that's the big difference. Skepticism is healthy curiosity. It's essential curiosity. Cynicism is just a negativity that's trying to prove everybody wrong. Does that make sense? If you're enjoying the Aging Well podcast, be sure to like, subscribe, or follow on your favorite platform so you will never miss an episode. And if you find our conversations helpful, please share the podcast with a friend, because aging is something we're all doing, and we're better at doing it together. And support our guests in this podcast financially by visiting the affiliate links in the episode description below and use the links or codes provided for discounts on products we have vetted and feel comfortable recommending to our valued viewers and listeners. Thank you, and now back to the podcast.
Yeah, it's also, I mean, I'm thinking of an event that kind of took place like 5 years ago, per se, 6 years ago. And there were large groups of people saying, this is the only way to do things, and you have to do this if you want this. And there was a small group of people that were like, well, hold on. Um, we don't have to do that. There are these other options. Our body can react in this way. These are the long-term effects. This is this. And there was so much pushback from that larger group, that perhaps that smaller group came off as, I guess, cynical, or in order to get their point across, where it's like, you guys aren't listening. We're backing up our evidence with science and literature, and you're not even listening, because the majority is telling you one thing, and you're not doing the research yourself. You're not questioning it. And so, I don't know. I agree with you that we need to think logically, and it's okay to question things. But sometimes when you have someone telling you that you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, sometimes it comes across as, you know what? No, I'm not wrong. And here's what I have that I'm going to lay down in front of you in order to prove that I am correct. And I'm backing my thoughts and opinion up with the evidence at hand. And that can come off as frustrating, but it's also, what's more frustrating is someone telling you how to live their life, or to live your life, and what decision is best for you, when they themselves haven't even done the research. Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
Well, why don't you just say you're talking about the COVID, era, and the COVID vaccines and everything. And I think that's a perfect example of a lack of healthy skepticism. I mean, there was no healthy skepticism on either side. I mean, there were some of us, I think, in the middle that were healthfully skeptic about the information that we were receiving, going into the literature and having an honest evaluation of the literature. I think that's a perfect example of where politics, personal beliefs, and agendas get in the way of healthy skepticism. There was, cynicism from both sides, or dismissal, but there was not healthy skepticism. And I think that is the perfect example of what we're trying to talk about here, is that you need to approach things not from a political point of view, not from an established scientific point of view, because that was one thing. We were being pushed at that period of time that, follow the science. And so, well, don't bullshit me and tell me you're following the science, because science questions everything,
Right.
And most of the information that was coming out on both sides, and I'm not going to take a political side on COVID, because I think both sides were so screwed up during that period of time that we made no progress in terms of health, because people just were locked into their personal beliefs and their political agendas, and nobody was willing to look at the whole picture. And so that's what we're talking about here with healthy skepticism, is being able to sit at a table with people with multiple points of view, question everyone's point of view, but have that discussion as to, well, why do you think what you think? What is the evidence? And here's what I think, and here's the evidence that I have. Let's address the evidence and see, what comes out on top. That's healthy skepticism. And curiosity is essential in that, because you need to have the attitude of, I want the truth. I want understanding. I want to know where I am wrong and where I am right. And it's not about being right. It's about finding the truth. And I don't think there was any of that in that period of time. And I still don't think we've recovered from that. We're probably just as bad, if not worse, with a lot of this stuff. And we see the same fights back and forth when it comes to, we've had conversations on this podcast about seed oils versus animal fats, and we can go down a whole big long list of the different things. This conversation is stemming out of some of the conversations we've had about the root cause protocol. And, you can get a lot of differing views on there. And, I'm in that area of skepticism and curiosity with it because I know it impacts my health and certain issues that, I will talk a lot more about as the podcast continues. Is, I get a little bit more of my blood work done and I make a few changes. But, I'm not diving whole hog into it that, Morley Robbins is 100% right in all this stuff. And I don't think, he is at a point of saying I'm 100% right. I mean, I thought was a really good example of healthy skepticism and curiosity. And if somebody presents him with evidence that says, I don't think you're right on here, well, he's going to look into it. And he's going to pull out article after article to be able to support what he wants to say. And so we can't just dismiss something because, well, I think you're wrong. I've always been taught that, high iron is essential. So I'm going to stick with that. You're totally wrong. And, the other side saying, well, no, that's totally wrong itself. You need to, limit your iron. Let's look at what's going on. Let's be curious and learn from it. And that's what I hope this podcast is all about, is that we're promoting healthy skepticism and promoting curiosity as opposed to presenting an agenda. And I think there's a lot of so-called influencers out on the internet that really are promoting an agenda. And you got to be skeptical about them. You have to question everybody and question us, because,
Right.
When I'm questioned, I'm going to learn from it.
Right. Well, I'm just thinking about some of the information, the topics of discussion that we've had on this podcast. And I went into it having one belief. And then after our open-ended discussion, I leave the podcast and I'm like, oh, that was pretty good. That was informational. And it kind of changes my thoughts. The seed oil versus animal fat, that example right there kind of opened my eyes a little bit and just changed my perspective on the entire conversation altogether when we launched that episode. So yeah, it's good. And I think it's okay to hear the other side. I think that's also really important. Like if you just like, I don't believe this, but then shut down altogether, you're not growing. You're kind of hindering yourself from growing, and you're not, like, you gotta have, you can disagree with it, you can be skeptical, but also hear the other side out. Like there's nothing. I think we need to go back to have those critical thinking conversations and critical listening conversations as well.
Yeah, and I don't think we're very good at that.
No. Well, let's move on. I feel like you've answered this one, but I'm just going to ask this question again. Why is skepticism particularly important as we age and are marketed to more aggressively by the health and wellness industry?
Well, I think as we age, we're more likely to encounter health issues. And so as we encounter certain changes in our health, there's going to be solutions that are presented to us. And I think in a lot of cases, we go to our doctor and we look at one symptom and we're immediately prescribed a medication. And we're not looking at what is the root cause of that issue. And you may have multiple issues that can be related, but we're not addressing what's the commonality in there. And so we start throwing a bunch of different medications at things. And of course, with those medications, there's going to be side effects. There's going to be, reductions in maybe certain nutrients or functions in our body that then now that's going to present another problem that has to be treated. And it goes back to kind of Dr. Patel's seesaw idea that, is we throw one thing at a problem, we disrupt something else. And then so we have to throw something at that in order to bring everything in balance. And we're going kind of back and forth with this seesaw effect to try and resolve issues, when in reality, it might just be adjusting the fulcrum, that point in the middle of the seesaw, and getting that in balance, and then everything else lines up. And so as we age, we're going to have more issues that will present us with a need for skepticism. And, we're just fed so much marketing BS from health and wellness industry, even from the medical profession. I mean, the pharmaceutical industry is there to make a dollar. Nobody can tell. I mean, okay, there's probably a few people working in, some of these big pharmaceutical companies that have a sincere desire to help people. But when it comes down to push comes to shove, it's all about the dollars. You're not going to get a drug out there that is going to be effective and cheap. It's going to be something that is generally expensive and minimally effective. And they don't care. They just want to make money. And, we're not looking at getting to the source of these issues. We're not looking at ways of getting people healthy so that they don't have to be treated for things. And, if there was money to be made in preventative health, that's where all the money would be going. But there's no money to be made, and so we don't worry about it. And you got to be skeptical. If somebody's pushing a drug at you or pushing a supplement at you, why are they pushing it? Do they sincerely want you to be healthy, or do they want to make a buck?
Yeah, wow, that's a really deep thought. You know what I mean? Like, that's really deep, especially on the subject of like aggressively pushing that product. Because they can use fear tactics. Oh, you need to take this because you're old and your heart's failing, or you need to take this because your cholesterol's too high, or maybe you need to take this because you're a female and your periods are irregulatory. So we're just gonna give you this hormone and see if we can balance that out. No, don't worry. Don't look into the science or anything. Don't look at what other effects that this prescription that I'm giving you has on your body, and may cause you to have another prescription prescribed to you. Don't worry about that. So yeah, that's a really deep, and I love how you brought up, let's find the root cause of the issue, not just the Band-Aid to cover the issue.
Let's pause for a moment to thank the affiliate partners who help support the Aging Well podcast. We're not sponsored, and no company pays for airtime here. But when you use our affiliate links, it helps us keep producing thoughtful, evidence-informed content. One brand I genuinely trust is Aura Wellness, especially their Glutarol, Glutarol Plus, and copper peptide formulations. I've spent time vetting their science, their ingredient quality, and their transparency. And I personally use these products in my own wellness routine. If you're interested in supporting the podcast and exploring tools that may help you feel and function better, check out Aura Wellness in the show notes.
Hey, Dr. Armstrong, let me ask you this, though. Where do you see people going wrong when skepticism becomes their default setting?
Well, I think they never really get to a correct answer. They're not willing to accept anything. So they're always skeptical. They're always looking at, well, this can't be right. And, so they tend to ignore evidence just for the sake of questioning. And so at some point, with skepticism, you have to come to some level of accepting. But, where we come wrong is that we don't look at, okay, well, if I go down this pathway, is it correct? And if it's correct, I keep going that way. If it's not, then how do I alter my path in order to get the most effective results? And so I think when people go wrong with skepticism is they just never really get out of that skeptic mode, if that makes any sense. It's like, I think maybe a best way to frame that is that people go wrong when skepticism becomes cynicism.
You say cynicism, but it sounds like stubborn. Like you're just stubborn. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? Like you're going down the path to see like if you're correct or if the other person's wrong, and when the evidence proves that the other person or study is correct, and you're like, nah, I don't believe it, and you keep going forward. That just is that stubbornness or is that cynicism?
Um, I think there's probably a fine line between stubbornism and cynicism. Stubborn people, if they're questioning but they're stubborn, they're basically asking the question because they want to prove you wrong,
Mm,
or they're just not simply asking the questions. They assume they're right. This is the way things have always been done, and so there's no need to question, no need to change. And so, we get into kind of a lot of semantics with all of this, but stubborn isn't necessarily a good path either. Um, People feel like this is the way I've always been. I've always done this. This is the way it is. And I guess we can kind of go back to any of the examples that we've given. You look at like seed oils or whatever it might be. People tend to really be stubborn about it, where they're not even going to examine the other side. Skepticism is kind of that addressing the question, well, maybe I'm not right on this. Maybe I need a little bit more information. And then, cynicism is going at it to prove the other person wrong. Stubborn is you're not even asking the questions anymore. You're just like, no,
right.
you're absolutely wrong. I know this is right. There's no need to question.
Hmm. Well, let's shift to curiosity. Why do you say curiosity isn't just helpful, but essential for aging well?
Well, I think it kind of goes back to that whole question of, of being stubborn, being cynical, being skeptical. It's when we're curious, we want to know more. It's like, well, this is what I've always understood, but why? I think
Mm,
of where did I hear this recently, and I've heard this story countless times, but came up recently. I don't know if it was on one of the podcast episodes or where I heard it, but the old story about the mother making a pot roast and cuts off the end of it and puts it in the pan. And so I guess, the story starts with the daughter, or making a pot roast. And her husband's like, why do you always cut the end off of the pot roast? And I don't know. It's the way my mom taught me to do it. And so she goes to her mom and says, Mom, why do we always cut the end off the pot roast? And she said, I don't know. That's the way my mom always did it. And it goes back now. I talked to Grandma, and Grandma's like, oh, well, I always cut the end off because my roasting pan was too small to fit the roast. And so we have to kind of understand, why do we do what we do? And I think when we have that healthy level of skepticism, we understand that history has taught us different things, and we've just kind of followed with what has been done in the past without not necessarily fully understanding why this has been done. I look at like iron, and I've been questioning iron a lot because I know my iron is a bit out of whack, and it might be contributing to problems such as my testosterone levels and my cholesterol levels and things like that. I grew up, iron supplementation. You need more iron, and never questioned any of that. We just accepted that this is what you do. And, there's so many what we believe to be healthy practices that have just been passed down that maybe were based on science, but it wasn't the best science, or it wasn't, really looking at the right questions. And so, we think of exercise. We talk a lot on here about the importance of strength training. And when I started studying exercise physiology, cardiovascular was what was being pushed.
Mm.
And we accepted that, you needed healthy heart health. And that meant low fat, high carbohydrate, doing a lot of aerobic exercise, not really focused on strength training. And where are we at now? We're looking at questioning all of that. Strength training is probably far more important than cardiovascular exercise when it comes to our overall well-being. We're questioning, how much carbohydrates, what kind of carbohydrates, how much protein, how much fat should be in the diet. And I don't think there's solid answers there now. And we can't just simply say, well, I like, paleo, or I like keto, and those are absolutely right. And you're wrong if you want to be a vegetarian, and, being on the vegetarian side saying meat is bad and you shouldn't be eating any of this. It's like, well, let's look at it more deeply. What's the healthy part of these particular diets? Why does this diet work for this person? Why does it not work for another person? And have that healthy skepticism that gets us diving deeper into the whys of, what are we doing, and, for what benefit and what purpose.
How does curiosity support adaptation, physical, cognitive, and emotional, as we age?
Well, I think, again, curiosity is going to drive change. And it's going to drive us to push beyond that to which we are accustomed to doing. And when we push beyond what we are accustomed to, that leads to adaptation. That's that basic principle of adaptation from physiology, right? That, in order for a body system to adapt, we have to push it to a level greater than that to which it is accustomed. And so from a physical standpoint, makes sense. If I try something different, it's going to promote a novelty in my body that's going to lead to some level of adaptation. When we look at it cognitively, knowledge grows by questioning. And a number of years ago, I was teaching a kinesiology class at Hope College, and I had a student that I love this student. He could come off as abrasive, and some of the students didn't like that. I loved it, and he, was willing to question things. And I was talking about rolling friction, and he questioned me. He said, I learned in physics that there's no such thing as rolling friction. And I'm like, well, okay, I'm not a physicist, but I'm pretty sure I'm right on this. And this is why. And so I was explaining it, and he was kind of countering with what he had been taught. And I said, well, we can't both be right. One of us has got to be wrong. And I had a student in the class that was like, well, Dr. Armstrong, just tell us what you want us to know. And I'm like, whoa, you don't understand. I don't want to stand up here and just tell you what I want you to know. I want you to know what is right, and I might be wrong. And so, after this class, I'm going to go look into it a little bit more, and one of us is going to be eating humble pie next class. And so maybe I'll bring some pie and ice cream, and we can have our humble pie a la mode. And I'm just kind of joking about that. And I went back and looked into it, and sure enough, I was right. And what this physics professor was teaching, while they were teaching it, was wrong. And so I brought in some pie, and the student also brought in this like I think it was like an ice cream cake or pie or something like that. And so we had a good laugh over it. But the thing that I was really trying to underscore to my students is that fundamental to a liberal education is respectful discourse. That if we don't question respectfully what's being taught to us or what we are hearing, then we can very easily, or can be very susceptible to misinformation. And so we need to question everything, but we have to do it respectfully. And I think that's one area that we have really lost over the most recent decades, is our ability to have that respectful discourse. And, again, discourse questioning has become very largely politicized. It's us and them, it's right, left, and it's not the way we grow. And so from a cognitive standpoint, we have to accept that, okay, maybe what I have learned in the past is At its worst, wrong. At its least, inadequate. And so there's always room to learn and to grow, and there's always more information out there. And as science develops, as our technology develops, we have the opportunity to learn more and more about our environment, about our universe. And so there's always room to grow and adapt cognitively, to learn more. And how it supports us emotionally is that we're not trapped in this sense of stagnation, or this sense of I'm absolutely right, or, if I'm not right, then, being wrong is such a bad thing. So from an emotional standpoint, especially as we age, it opens us up to being more pliable and to be more open to others' opinions, and being less driven by external sources. So we can have a greater sense of control over our situation and feel more like we have that self-efficacy and that capacity to learn and to change and to grow when we are more curious. Does that make sense, and does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does make sense. It reminds me, there's like this old saying, there's three sides to every story. There's yours, there's mine, and then there's the truth. And I think by having curiosity, you're not saying like my side's the right version of the story and your side's the wrong version of the story. You're kind of meeting in the middle. We're piecing my side, we're piecing your side, and together we're coming up with the truth, right? We're getting, just like the debate with you and that student, he had his opinion, you had your opinion, and yet you guys met in the middle. You did your own research. You went on like, hey, am I right? Are they right? Like, what are the facts say? And you came up with what the truth was. And it was an eye-opening experience. And it's probably good for you too, because just because we know something now doesn't mean that that information is always 100% accurate. You have admitted you're thinking about writing a book called, the lies that you taught when you were a college professor. And it's, at the time, they weren't lies. It was information that was out there, but the data and the information, it's changed. That's what's cool about science, is it's always growing, it's always evolving, it's ever moving. So yeah, I think it does make a lot of sense.
Yeah, and it's a good point. Just thinking of Dr. Robert Lufkin's book, The Lies I Taught in Medical School. And, we tend to be so dogmatic in terms of this is the truth, this is the way things are done. And we're not willing to change. And when we're not willing to change, we're going to harm people, because we're withholding, not necessarily withholding misinformation or truthful information. We just aren't allowing ourselves to examine the truth more closely. And, when I've taught statistics courses, and you talk in terms of, we take measurements, and that measurement, there's always some level of error. So, the measurement is basically equal to the truth plus or minus error, right? And, I hate the word proven when it comes to science. And that's a huge red flag for me, and drives my skepticism up when I hear somebody say, well, it's clinically proven. Well, it's not clinically proven. It's clinically demonstrated. And yes, that there might be a preponderance of evidence that this is truth, but we never report that any science is 100% accurate. It's not 100% conclusive. You get to, they call them p-values, the probability of the result that you got being due to anything greater than, randomness. And, the bigger that probability number is that it's error, then the less trust we can have in that particular value. but that value never gets down to zero. I mean, you'll see things reported as a p less than 0.001 is about the smallest you'll report it. But that less than 0.001 means there's still a 1 out there somewhere in those number of zeros after the decimal point. It never, ever gets to a perfect 0.
Yeah. Hey, I do have a question. I started thinking about it. You know how you had one student that questioned you, and then you had another student say, "Hey, just tell us what the answer is and we'll do whatever." So I guess my question is, do you see curiosity as a trainable skill, or is it something people either have or they don't?
It's a good question. I would hope it's trainable. I think it's an innate skill. You look at a small child, kids have tremendous amounts of curiosity. They're always, why is this? What's this? And, kids ask questions to a point of being annoying sometimes, right? They always want to know why, and they don't accept just, well, it's because I say so. My daughter still at, 17 going on 18, she's like, that's not an answer, Dad. You can't just say, because I say so. And so kids have a tremendous amount of curiosity. So I'd have to say it is something that we all have, but we lose it and we don't train it. So as we get older, some of that curiosity gets squashed down, and whether that's a fault of our education system, a fault of parenting, fault of society, whatever it might be, I think it's something that we tend to use or lose, not necessarily something that we can train. So it's kind of that principle of reversibility. You use it or you lose it. And we either continue and use our curiosity, or we don't use it and we lose it. Does that make reasonable amount of sense?
Totally makes sense. It just opens up more questions like, what can we do as a society to not lose it? Like, does it start in elementary school? Because you're absolutely correct. You talk to a kid, we have nieces and nephews, and they ask why a lot. Why? How come? Why? Why is that? Why are you doing that? Why? Even when you give them an answer, they still want to know why. They want a question. They're trying to understand. And I think, from what I can remember, almost all of us were like that at some point. And the older we get, we just kind of lose that. And it could be a combination of, I don't care what the answer is. I just want to get this test over with, and I'll just, whatever gets me a good grade, or whatever keeps my job, or whatever allows me to enter a building, and whatever gets me to the front of the line and pay. Like, I don't care. Even if I disagree, I'm just gonna do it because I don't want to deal with it. Or people are like, well, this person told me and I trust them because they know more than I do. And I don't know. That's a really good point. And I don't know how we can eliminate the hindrance of not having that critical thinking, or that curiosity, and how we can increase it. I don't know where we could go about that. So
I think it's education.
Yeah.
We need an education system that's not teaching kids to the test. It's an education system that is teaching kids to be curious, to question everything, and not just be dogmatic. It's like, this is what I say. And so I do think it really begins in our education system. We'll take a quick pause to acknowledge the affiliate brands that help make this podcast possible. These aren't sponsors, and no one pays for placement. But when you use our affiliate links, it supports the mission of the Aging Well podcast. One partner I've chosen after careful vetting is Berkeley Life, known for their nitric oxide support products. I value their commitment to quality, testing, and education around vascular wellness, and I use their products myself. If you'd like to support the show and explore Berkeley Life for your own health journey, you'll find a link in the episode description.
Well, Dr. Armstrong, what happens when skepticism starts to crowd out curiosity over time?
Well, I think probably a better way of phrasing it is probably, what happens when cynicism starts to crowd out curiosity over time.
Mm,
Because I think it is, again, we're talking about skepticism being healthy, but curiosity being essential. Um, we want to not lose that childlike curiosity, that willingness to ask the questions and always question things. And I think sometimes, curiosity is just wonder, that idea of just in being awe of everything and being, and this I think is kind of sometimes where we bring in the kind of the spiritual piece of the spies model, that, spiritual is that wonder and that awe of the universe and everything around us. And that childlike wonder is a very positive thing. But skepticism begins to be doubting everything. And sometimes if skepticism starts to lead to just doubting everything, then we lose a bit of that curiosity. We don't look for the right things. And we just start, skepticism can very quickly evolve into cynicism if we're not curious enough. That makes sense.
So, okay, I'm just going to repeat back to help myself understand, make sure I got the right message. Um, Skepticism is good, especially when it comes with that level of childlike curiosity. But with skepticism, it can, if we go too deep into the skepticism, then we can almost become jaded and cynical and not having that trust where any information that we're given, we're just like, nope, don't believe it, or no, I'm right, you're wrong. And so skepticism is a great tool and it is essential, but it's something that if if we go too deep down it, it can cause us to be cynical, I guess you could say. And so if you're going to be skeptical, keep the childlike curiosity to go with it.
Yeah, I think the skepticism kind of guides the curiosity. But being skeptical, then it opens the door to curiosity, it allows us to be questioning of things and wondering what is and what isn't. But again, as we get through that door, then there's two possible openings, from skepticism. It's either going down that pathway of cynicism where you're just trying to prove everything wrong, or curiosity where you're trying to learn everything that you can learn about everything.
Oh, how about this question? How does that kind of rigid thinking quietly show up in people's health behaviors, relationship, or an outlook on aging?
Well, I think, if we're looking at the curiosity piece, we look at, okay, this particular thing came up in my recent doctor's exam. Why am I this way? Why is it this way? Is there something I'm not doing in my diet, something I am doing in my diet, or, is it the type of exercise that I'm doing, or how can I actually improve on this? And so that always leads to kind of that positivity, leads to good change in our behavior. Whereas if we become more cynical, more skeptic, we don't ever really take that positive advice. And so, in our health behaviors and our relationships, all that, it can cause division if we're not, the curiosity piece. I think the essentialness of curiosity brings us together because we're open and we're wanting to learn more and understand better. And so, it brings us together as people, whereas that cynicism tends to separate us. And it brings us further and further apart. And I think there's a certain level of optimism versus pessimism when you take those approaches. When you're curious, the door is open to optimism. If you're cynical, then the pathway leads to pessimism.
Is this one of the reasons why some people feel old long before they actually are?
Could be. We tend to have that stereotypical image of the old man, get off my grass, stay off my lawn. And we have, maybe it's a bit of a stereotype, but maybe it's not. When we think of that crotchety old person that's really cynical and negative, and yeah, maybe we do as we age and we've lost that curiosity and we lose that childhood wonder. It makes us feel old. I don't know. I think there's a certain youthful feel to being curious and being exploratory, and you just see people light up when they are learning something new. And when we become more dogmatic, it just tends to slow our bodies down and just lead to a bit more of that decline in our well-centeredness.
Right. Side note, I just have to say, I am that crotchety old man. I bought a house and we live right in between a middle school and a high school. And I got to say, the middle schoolers, or not a middle school and elementary school, and the middle schoolers, as they walk up our road, they will literally just take their wrappers of food or their drinks and just toss it into our lawn. And then on their way home, especially during summertime when the weather gets nicer, they'll just walk into our driveway and just lean on our cars and just start talking. And you're like, what are you guys doing? Like, get out of here, go away and go pick up your trash. Don't just leave it. Every Saturday, my wife and I try and get some yard work done. And there's so much garbage that's in our little front area. And you're like, dude, did they just hang out and have a picnic on our lawn? Like, I don't get it. So I have become that old crotchety man. I'm like, get off my lawn.
Yeah.
All right. Sorry.
Yes, it is part of aging, but
yeah. Let's get back on subject. So, Dr. Armstrong, some listeners might worry that being curious means being easily swayed. And how do we stay open without becoming gullible?
Now, I think, when we start looking at gullible versus cynicism and curiosity being in the middle of that, gullible isn't asking questions. It's just accepting everything that's fed to us. And so I think we have to, again, maintain that level of curiosity. And I don't know if I have the answers for how do we go about doing that. But we need an attitude of curiosity to prevent us from just being sucked into everything. We keep going to kind of some of the longevity science and supplements and those types of things. How many people go on YouTube or, Instagram or other social medias and see some influencer saying that, need to take this particular supplement. And, if you're buying into all of the branding and marketing out there, you are gullible. If it sparks curiosity, we say, wow, that sounds interesting. Let me look at the science. That's going to get you to the right answer. And, if you just assume that everything is off, that nothing is right, then, you might miss out on some healthful information, and so the best way is just, again, to just lean into that curiosity, be willing to question everything and not just accept everything as fact and not accept everything as false. So look at where lies the truth. And that's what's going to keep us from being gullible, and that's what's going to keep us from being overly cynical.
Well, what question should people be asking to balance curiosity with discernment?
Well, I think we can begin with what's the real science behind this. Again, if
Mm,
we're asking questions regarding aging well, most of that there's going to be some science based in it. Or what is my experience? I think the questions we should be asking are why, how, who, when. All those basic, simple questions that we learned to ask as a kid. It's like who might be the first question? Who is giving me this information? You know, what are they potentially gaining from this information? What does the science say about this information? What does my personal experience or the experience of other people that I know have with this information? And what are the alternatives to this information? So I think it's not about what questions per se, but just simply asking questions are going to enable us to balance that curiosity with discernment.
right.
Because curiosity, we can just be bouncing all over the place and not having a level of understanding is going to prevent us from fully answering the questions. So I think what really helps us balance that is asking the questions about that why and how, if that makes any sense at all.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think the one thing is you mentioned like, how does this make me feel? And I don't know, maybe.
I don't think I said make us feel. I think what I was
Oh,
saying
okay.
is
I thought I heard
how
that, and
does,
I was like,
uh,
sometimes situations like if when we have a feeling, sometimes that feeling can become so overwhelming that it prevents us from having that critical thinking process. And it's okay to take a moment and breathe and be quiet, and then be like, okay, what are the facts here?
yeah,
Does that make
no,
sense?
I'm not. Yeah, I'm not talking necessarily about intuition, although we can follow our gut. What is my gut telling me? Is a reasonable question to ask in terms of balancing curiosity with discernment. But I think what it was really talking about is terms of how does this particular if I'm using a supplement or some other exercise or whatever it might be, whatever the
Hmm.
question is at hand, is what is my experience with this particular issue. And so balancing our curiosity and the knowledge that we see, say, in the scientific literature or what's being presented to us in popular press or on the internet, with what is my experience with this particular situation, is going to help us to discern a little bit more effectively what is truth. So we need a certain level of that intuitive gut feeling, but we also have to balance that with what does the harder science tell us, and what does experience tell us with this situation. So we're balancing kind of the gut with scientific evidence with personal experience, because
You think?
again, with personal experiences, sometimes an N of one is more important than an N of 10,000,
Hmm.
because we're all individuals. We all respond differently. And, the number of people involved in a study is just a sampling of the entire population. And there's plenty of opportunity for population or sampling bias to kind of creep into the literature that we might be reading.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm gonna ask this question, and I don't mean to like I'm not trying to come off as argumentative, and I'm just curious. Do you think one's personal experience can be affected by uh, their own perspective of the experience? Does that make sense what I'm saying? So, like, if you and I we went to one event and we were both there at the exact same time, and we stood right next to each other and we witnessed something, and you were like, man, it was great. It was an awesome thing. But then from my point of view, it was, oh my gosh, it was horrible. It was terrifying. There was all these cruel things happening. And then you were like, wasn't that, wasn't that, wasn't that bad at all. It was literally just people dancing at the concert or whatever. Like, I don't, does that make sense? What I'm saying is, yeah, we want to
Yeah, I
go
think
based
it
off of
makes
our,
sense. I'm not sure if the actual analogy is kind of clicking perfectly, but I see what you're saying. Where we have different, we have subjective and objective measures of reality. And it comes down to everybody having a slightly different point of view of things, and our experience interacts with us. Again, going back to our SPIES model, we have different foundations of our spiritual, physical, intellectual, emotional, and social well-being, or of our persons. And so we are going to have different responses to different stimuli. Doesn't make your reaction or your response any greater or lesser than mine. It's just different. And so we have to weigh in the collective experience as well as our own personal experience. And so we have to be willing, if we're going to be curious and to be skeptical, to understand that our subjective perception of things has some level of error in it, that our view is not perfect. Somebody else's view is not imperfect. It's just, well, it is imperfect, but you know what I mean? It's not wrong. It's not a right or wrong. It's just a bit more of an element of different. And when we experience those different perceptions, then we have to be open to, well, what is right in my perception and what is right in your perception? And be willing to look at it from a broader lens rather than just say, well, I'm right, you're wrong. This was my experience. I don't know where you get that experience from. You're just
right.
a complete idiot. So, I mean, that's the way our society goes, right? We
Right.
look at, well, this is my perspective and it's right. You are wrong. Rather than understanding that, we both probably are wrong on this. So let's figure out what's the common thread here and get closer to what reality is.
Right. Well, and I think it's a level of maturity to recognize the factor of, my perception may not be as accurate, and that can be a challenge. Once someone has that growth mindset to do it, that alone is a wonderful trait to have for aging well. Uh, Dr. Armstrong, how does curiosity fit into a broader theme of transformative aging this season?
Well, I'm hoping that that's our whole point of the transformational aging, is that we are opening up that curiosity, and we're addressing with a certain level of skepticism what is the reality of our world and how that impacts us as an aging population. And, so being curious is going to open the door for us to explore more things rather than, just accepting what is fed to us. We're asking questions, and curiosity is transformative. It's not dogmatic.
Mm. Which dimension of um, which dimension of the SPIES model do you think curiosity most strongly influences, or does it cut across all of them?
I think it cuts across all of them. I mean, the way we formulate the SPIES model, where we have the spiritual and the physical at the foundation, the physical being our perceptions of what is, around, the measurable perception of reality. The spiritual is that awe and that wonder of the reality, and bringing those together begins to challenge us intellectually and want us to explore and gain more information. And then, how we interact with that curiosity, so the awe and wonder should bring us closer together relationally, so that I can understand you better, you understand me better, we understand our realities better. And the emotional piece is that keystone. It's what ties it all together. And having a level of emotional maturity allows us to maintain that level of curiosity without it leading into becoming gullible or becoming cynic. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. Well, we also touched on it almost this whole episode, so it
Yeah.
definitely makes sense. Hey, well, what about this? So, for someone listening right now, what's one small way they could practice curiosity this week without abandoning healthy skepticism?
I think one easy small way is to read something. Read something in an area that you're interested in, or we can in journaling. Ask a question. What do I want to learn today? What am I curious about today? And just explore that curiosity. Be open to wonder a little bit more. We go outside, look around more, embrace in the environment around us. And this is something I'm not that good at. I talked a little bit about my psilocybin experience and how that opened up a bit more of my curiosity and my wonder and just my attentiveness to everything going on around me. And, it really opened the door to me to say, I need to be a bit more curious. And I'm a very curious person. I wouldn't have become a scientist and a professor if I wasn't curious. But I think it's important for us just to, step by step, just trying to learn something new. Ask a question. Just be questioning. That's the simple thing. Ask a question. That's the simplest thing that we can do to be more curious, is ask a question.
Well, speaking of asking question, what's a simple question people can start asking themselves when they encounter new health information?
I probably think, to keep it simple so that we don't draw out this podcast much longer, is why. Ask why. You get more health information. Why? Why is
And
this
how?
important? And how? But again, you start asking, okay, why, how, when, where, and just ask those simple questions. But I think how is probably the easiest question, because how is this affecting me?
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Armstrong, if you had to leave the listeners with one mindset shift about skepticism and curiosity, what would it be?
Well, I think probably the mindset shift would be, I would say that that old adage that curiosity killed the cat is BS. It's like curiosity is probably what's going to save the cat. It's being open and being willing to challenge your mind and your knowledge, and just be open to the wonder of the universe is life-giving.
Wow. Any final thoughts on why this balance matters more than ever?
I would say that the balance between skepticism and curiosity is probably no more mattering now than ever, but it's more important that we re-engage with it now than ever, because we are in the most technologically advanced period in history. We have more information accessible to us at any moment than in history. And if we don't know how to question that properly, or look for the information that could make our lives better, we're going to lose out. We're not going to age well.
So to summarize, with all the copious amounts of information that we have at our fingertips, that's constantly being bombarded to us, and in a world that's ever changing and evolving from the past generations to where it's at now, it's okay to have a curiosity of, how is this going to affect me? How is this going to affect my family? Why do we need to do things this way? It's okay to have that childlike innocence when you're skeptical about certain scenarios. Be careful not to allow the skepticism to jade your heart. It's all right to ask questions. This is all healthy, this is all essential, and this is all a must if you would like to age well.
Age well. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Aging Well podcast. Please like, subscribe, or follow, and share this episode with a friend. And be sure to visit the affiliate links in the description below. Thank you for listening, and until next time, keep aging well.